Welcome to this closing roundtable session. I'm Lehrer. I'm a cultural anthropologist and a curator, and as we agreed to do very, very short introductions today, I'll just say that I've worked mostly in Poland on Jewish heritage, and I also founded Concordia University's Curating and Public Scholarship Lab, which is an experimental space for translating humanities scholarship into exhibition form. Just a few logistics. This is a 90-minute session, I understand, so I will just give brief framing remarks to begin, and then I'll introduce each discussant who will speak for 5 minutes. And after that, we'll have an open discussion which the panelists can engage with each other, but also, of course, with the larger audience. And because this is the final session, we really wanted just to open a space to reflect together about what we've heard over the last 3 days, point to areas that we think still need attention, and also consider where we think museums need to go with their engagements with conflicted histories. We titled the roundtable Thinking Through the Museum, Difficult Knowledge in Public, because that's the name of a research project that the Canadian contingent of this panel is involved with. So let me just say a few words about the project, and as well as why I hoped it might be interesting to bring my Canadian and Polish colleagues together in conversation. So first, as some of you heard from Monica Patterson earlier today, our research group has been working with a concept of difficult knowledge that comes from psychoanalytically informed education theory. And it suggests that rather than seeing certain concrete topics as difficult, such as war, genocide, or oppression, that difficulty rather exists in the relationship between audiences and whatever material may challenge their familiar, comfortable identity frameworks, leading to various kinds of refusal, avoidance, breakdowns, or more ideally, a kind of productive unsettlement. And here I'd actually like to suggest just a little tweak to the conference title. Rather than museums and their publics at sites of conflicted history, we might say museums and their publics are sites of conflicted history, because museums have historically been complicit in violence, pillage, and systems of oppression, as well as being sites of resistance, activism, and the negotiation of power relations. And of course, it's important to remember, as Monica also emphasized, that the experience of difficulty is very unevenly distributed across our societies and our world. And indeed, the lack of recognition of each other's suffering may be the most difficult part of all. In practical terms, our research group observes that opportunities to learn from difficult knowledge are limited when institutions like museums are under pressure to produce positive visitor experiences or narratives of national or community pride, which always reinforce marginalizations, blind spots, and omissions. Thus, we are asking what curatorial and pedagogical practices might be fostered in such spaces to allow people to grapple with difficult knowledge in generative ways. How might opportunities for learning be opened up? What risks do we anticipate or have we begun to encounter in our work? Our project brings together scholars, curators, museum practitioners, and diverse publics to collaborate on the best approaches to these questions. Now, the Canadian Museum for Human Rights has been the inspiration for our project, and you'll hear more from project director Angela Fehler about that. But I mention it here in relation to the POLIN museum in which we sit. The two museums both formally opened in fall of 2014, both situated in societies that have in recent decades been grappling with the shadow sides of their own national histories in highly public ways. Both museums frame themselves as spaces of pluralist democracy, hope, and critical thinking. And both have been subject to criticism, most harshly by leftist intellectuals who argue that these museums are doing the opposite of what they advertise, that through their curatorial choices, sponsorship, even their architecture and construction processes, they are doomed to highlight the celebratory and allied challenging topics. So these two contexts offer an interesting comparative opportunity to ask about the challenges that arise when museums, especially national-level museums, attempt to curate histories of violence and injustice in which the nation has been complicit. Broadly speaking, the comparison at hand is between, on the Polish side, a post-socialist and post-Holocaust setting that's also extremely ethno-religiously homogenous and is currently governed in a strongly ethno-nationalistic mode. And on the Canadian side, a decolonizing situation that is also multicultural by both policy and reality, although not, of course, not unproblematically. So can museum institutions in either setting question cherished collective myths of heroism and tolerance? To what extent can they be self-critical, and how? What progressive social, political, and educational functions can such museums serve? And most interesting for our research, what roles can scholars, activists, artists, and citizens play in holding these institutions to their highest stated mandates, or even expanding these mandates? This includes not only their content or modes of representation, but how audiences are imagined and encouraged by these museums to be, and what these visitors are allowed and expected to do. And finally, echoing what someone in the audience asked earlier in a session today, while many of us agree that we want museums to be critical and deconstructive of politicized meta-narratives, is criticality sufficient? And what kind? I'm certainly not averse to what I call shaming methodologies, by which museums are pressured to change by scholarship or media attention or community activism or guerrilla artistic interventions that air museums' historical and contemporary dirty laundry. But critics often work from ungrounded, if not utopian ideals, so it's worth asking also whether we have viable theories of change. Are we willing to compromise, to partner with such institutions to help them be more critical within their economic, political, spatial, and other constraints? What beyond national narratives, or perhaps any master narratives, do we want our history and cultural museums to construct? Can part of critical museology be to envision museums as spaces of new identifications and solidarities or stories, for social network building, for the sharing of authority among differently situated actors, for empathy, for pleasure, for mourning, for healing, even for varieties of the sacred, and so on, just not in a modernist, universalist, hierarchical mode? What, in short, are we actually in praise of? This challenge of constructive imagination is also central in our thinking through the museum project, and it's also embodied in Shelley Butler's notion of curatorial dreaming, in which critics are asked to envision curatorial solutions that respond to their own critiques. So one hope I have for this final discussion is that we can think about possible futures for museums, including how scholars might possibly engage with them in ways that go beyond arm's length critique, without losing the critical lens that has historically been the Academy's key contribution. Moving now on to our panelists. While I want to recognize the fabulous new high-profile institutions like the one that we are in for the kind of quantum leap in raising the bar that in many domains of Polish museology that, for example, this museum has done, I also wanted to draw attention to theorists and practitioners, particularly here in Poland, who are working more quietly to reconfigure museum institutions and the possible relations that curators, scholars, and various publics can have with them. I will introduce each person in very brief terms before they speak. You'll just have to take my word for the fact that they are all absurdly accomplished, and also that they wear many hats as scholars, curators, activists, and members of different social groups that inform their work. I've asked each of them to address where they confront difficult knowledge in their work with museums and how they try to address it. I've urged them to be as real with their examples as they are willing to risk in this setting, to talk about the way that politics, institutional power relations, and their own emotions and subjectivities inform their attempts to do critical work with museums, as we so rarely get to hear about failures in this kind of work, but they can be actually quite illuminating. So first, I'd like to introduce and turn the floor over to Professor Angela Thaler, who leads University of Winnipeg's Cultural Studies Research Group, which focuses on the new Canadian Museum for Human Rights. And she's also the principal investigator on our team research project, Thinking Through the Museum, Difficult Knowledge in Public. Angela.
So I work and live in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is the home of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, or the CMHR for short. The CMHR, as Erica mentioned, is still relatively new. It opened in the fall of 2014, around the same time that POLIN opened. And it's Canada's first national museum to be built outside of Ottawa, the national capital region. And just for some wider context, presently, across Canada, Indigenous settler relations are at the forefront of many pressing issues and current public debates over land claims, fossil fuel extraction and pipeline development, water security, safe and affordable housing, child welfare system reform, police on citizen violence, over-incarceration, and the epidemic of missing and murdered girls and women. And these are all issues that are disproportionately affect First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and that are understood to be effects of Canada's ongoing legacy of colonial violence. Some of you may have heard in other presentations at this conference that Canada has also recently held a Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Indian residential schools. The schools were a state and church-sponsored program of genocide that removed First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children from their families, placed them in these schools, stripped them of language, of culture, of bodily integrity, and often of their lives. So the conclusion of this commission saw 94 calls to action towards reconciliation, including several that were directed specifically at Canadian museums and archives to undertake a review of themselves that would ensure that they were reflecting on the principles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in their exhibitions, content, and programming. So the CMHR emerges in this context and is located in Winnipeg, a city that is often cited for having the largest urban Indigenous population in Canada. And this is a population that is, on the one hand, among the most disenfranchised and stigmatized members of our community, and on the other, that has made Winnipeg a really crucial center for Indigenous art, political activism, and cultural revivification. The CMHR would seem then, in ways ideally positioned to play a critical role in reshaping national narratives and building new relationships between the state, First Peoples, and non-Indigenous Canadians, and to be part of a process of positive social change that acknowledges the connection of the past to ongoing and present effects of colonial violence. The CMHR itself, which is pictured in the slide behind me, was a huge undertaking, a $350 million build after a design by an American architect, Antoine Predoct. The museum boasts 47,000 square feet of gallery space. It's composed of materials from around the world, glass from Germany, Mongolian basalt buttressing, reflection pools, illuminated alabaster ramps quarried in Spain, and then local Tyndallstone from Manitoba. And despite winning numerous awards for being an architectural wonder, the museum has faced multiple criticisms on a number of fronts, and I'll just mention two key ones. That it has failed in ways to substantively address the link between Canada's colonial past and present. And second, its inability or failure to respond to issues on its very doorsteps. And I'll just cite one briefly. Around the time that the discovery of a body of a young Indigenous woman from Saking First Nation, her name was Tina Fontaine, her murdered body was found in the river that flows past the museum, and the spot where it was recovered was, in view of the museum. This was being reported on locally, provincially, and nationally in the news. On this day, the museum was tweeting about the latest developments in its gift shop. So clearly a kind of missed opportunity. So what critics, including myself, has noticed is that the museum ultimately has emphasized Canadian benevolence and downplayed Canada's own implication in human rights and Indigenous rights abuses, has framed human rights in depoliticized language. There's been an emphasis on positive stories and heroism and on overcoming human rights challenges. What I'm particularly interested in is actually, I mean, perhaps none of this is surprising, given that, as Ho-Chunk scholar Amy Lonetree has argued in Decolonizing Museums, that national museums have long served the colonial project of state formation and official memory. But what I'm particularly interested in is in how this museum's current strategies actually signal a resistance to engagements with difficult knowledge, and how this resistance in turn manifests as a particular form of institutionalized affect, namely that of compulsory hope, or what I've been calling hope as an affect imperative. So just briefly, there is an architectural embodiment of this hope imperative that characterizes the museum, and it is the Tower of Hope, which is this architectural feature at the top of the building. This feature, the Tower of Hope, is meant to symbolize the goal of the human rights journey, namely hope for a changed world. The tower is meant to be the pinnacle of the visitor journey, which is laid out through a narrative of ascension from darkness, where the indigenous roots of the museum are, to light. Through this Tower of Hope. So, the progress narrative of enlightenment is quite apparent, and I think also problematic. So is there a way, so my argument is that this overlaying of hope, this assumption of hope, forecloses particular opportunities for visitors to encounter and engage with difficult knowledge. And my question is, are there different approaches to hope that might open a space? And I turn in my own research to the work of Roger Simon, who uses the phrase hope without consolation. And this is a version of hope that might be cultivated from within experiences of difficult knowledge, where histories of violation and injustice can be connected to circumstances of the present without needing to be minimized or overcome by universalizing transcendent narratives of empowerment and futurity, which I argue is, what this particular feature and the broader narrative of the museum itself represents. So I'm already over time. I'll leave it there.
So next, I will pass the microphone to, after I speak into it, to Dr. Shelley Ruth Butler, who teaches at McGill University and wrote a widely cited ethnography of the controversial 1989 museum exhibition Into the Heart of Africa at the Royal Ontario Museum, and was lead editor on the 2016 volume Curatorial Dreams, Critics Imagine Exhibitions.
Thank you. Is this about the right volume? Yeah? Okay. Difficult knowledge challenges one's sense of self or collective identity, including feelings of moral and political clarity. Last November, I attended a private official apology at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. Can I get, sorry.
This one.
Okay, great. I attended a private official apology at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. The museum acknowledged that its controversial exhibition Into the Heart of Africa from over 2 decades earlier had, quote, perpetuated an atmosphere of racism, contributed to anti-African racism, and caused suffering by insensitively representing colonialist images and discourses. In the past, the museum had expressed regret for hurt that was felt by protesters. Now, finally, the museum took responsibility for its actions. Unlike the original the exhibit, the apology was a collaborative effort between the museum and its public. Knowing that protesters negotiated a joint statement with the museum over a 2-year period, it was moving to witness the apology. I want to share with you moments of difficult knowledge that I experienced during the apology. One, a memory of distress during my fieldwork when a close friend showed little empathy for the protesters. Two, a memory of the elation I felt as I understood the nuances and strategic nature of the protesters' exclusionary rhetoric. Three, a sense of cynicism about public apologies in Canada while feeling that this one was meaningful. Four, ambivalence in realizing that my ethnography was not viewed as activist, even though many activists and colleagues express regard for it. And five, confusion that there was no space to acknowledge the aggression of protesters toward the female white curator at the time. And finally, clarity when I understood how past strident claims over who could and could not represent Africa at the museum were in fact surpassed without words. In accepting the museum's apology, protesters and allies implicitly expressed goodwill toward the new curator of the museum's permanent African gallery that opened in 2008, Italian anthropologist Silvia Forni. The apology, I argue, enacted a respectful meeting ground between the mostly white staff and board members of the museum and the predominantly black guests. The participatory invocation by a Ghanaian priest, the speeches and stories, the refreshments, each element demonstrated hospitality. I use hospitality thinking of writer Tom King's critiques of the bad manners of anthropologists and colonial bureaucrats. In contrast, Hildy Hein proposes the museum as a, quote, site for learning good manners on a vastly public scale. Her point is not about superficial niceties, but rather an image of museums helping us live with discontinuity, fragmentation, and ambiguity. This links to the process of living with difficult knowledge. Living with difficult knowledge is iterative. It takes discipline and practice. At McGill University, my undergraduate students are eager to engage with our country's legacies of colonialism and racism, especially through visual culture, including film and museum exhibits. The challenge for many of them is to sustain engagement as they embark on competitive graduate programs and careers, privileged internships, and possibly return to smaller social and political circles than they experienced in university. It can be likened to township tourists who are keen to witness and experience, in quotes, legacies of apartheid in the immersive in situ logic of the tour, while they do not see, let alone engage with, comparable scenes of inequality and injustice at home. Recently, I've enjoyed dialogues with students about transgender identities, in part because I can concretely describe my process of moving from ignorance to deep interest, aided by conversations and good journalism. I would like to add museums as well. In what could be called radical performance art, the youthful Black Lives Matter movement of Toronto interrupted this year's Pride Parade to draw attention to their marginalization and bad experiences with the police, who in recent years have joined the parade. The protesters' intervention generated acrimonious debate about whether the police should be excluded from the parade, and about concepts like privilege, solidarity, struggle, assimilation, memory, and forgetting. The Royal Ontario Museum, located not far from the parade route, would be an ideal space to bring together people, objects, stories, and art to explore this instance of contemporary difficult knowledge.
Okay, well, so next we have Professor Heather Igloliorte, who is a Concordia University Research Chair in Indigenous Art History and Community Engagement, as well as having been an active curator for 12 years dealing with Native North American art.
Hi. I'm just going to jump right in because we're on the clock. In Canada, there are 3 Indigenous groups. First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. But these three groups represent a hugely diverse population of about 60 distinct peoples, with as many languages and dialects and cultures, several hundred dispersed Indigenous communities, not to mention high urban populations located throughout northern and southern Canada. We may be many different peoples, but we are united by our shared history of colonization in Canada and our ongoing efforts to decolonize. In fact, this year marks the 150th anniversary of Canada, and our country is currently, or it will be more so when it gets a little bit warmer, engaged in many celebrations, exhibitions, festivals, public art commissions, and lots of other well-funded activities meant to build national pride. Yet this year is also a major year for art and museum projects related to the conclusion of our National Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Residential Schools, which finished its 5-year fact-finding and testimony-gathering campaign in 2015, followed by the release of a major report including 94 recommendations for moving forward in reconciliation between Indigenous peoples and settler Canadians. The TRC report addressed what was a long, silent, and unknown history in Canada, representing perhaps the worst single act of the Canadian nation state against our Indigenous peoples, the residential school system, which Angela just mentioned. This system was implemented soon after the 1867 formation of the Canadian nation state in the early 1870s, and which continued until well into the late 20th century. As Angela just noted, the purpose of residential schools was, put simply, to assimilate the Aboriginal population into the dominant colonial culture by removing children from the care of their parents and communities and placing them far away in institutions from their homes, indoctrinating them into Christian and European ideologies, and prohibiting them from speaking in their Indigenous languages or practicing their culture. In these schools, children experienced rampant sexual, physical, and mental abuse. And in recent years, scholars have even uncovered that Indigenous students were used in things such as medical experiments. For example, Ian Mosby's research has recently uncovered details of highly unethical nutrition experiments performed without parents' consent or information on Canadian Aboriginal children at 6 residential schools between 1942 and 1952, not that long ago, where groups of children were systematically deprived of nutrients over years to test the efficacy of, for example, vitamin supplements. These federally funded church-run schools had been operating throughout southern Canada since the 1870s and continued unabated until the 1970s, although the last school closed really around 1996. Residential schools were a deliberate act of genocide as constituted under the UN Convention on Genocide, noting the causing of serious bodily or mental harm to members of a group, deliberately inflicting on a group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or part, and forcibly transferring children of one group to another group. Studies have shown that the post-traumatic stress disorder evidenced in residential school survivors is likened to that of war veterans and includes the attendant self-harm, substance abuse, and mental health issues. And further, this trauma has been passed on intergenerationally from survivors to their children and communities today. Not only is this not an event from our distant past, as many Canadians seem to wish to believe. My father was a residential school survivor, my aunts and uncles are residential school survivors. Most Indigenous people in Canada today have a direct relative who went to a residential school. But in our neo-colonial moment, it is also important to note that there are more Indigenous children adopted out or in foster care today than at the height of the residential school system. Our nation not only continues to remove children from Indigenous communities under the guise of saving them, but has in fact increased its efforts to forcibly transfer Indigenous children to non-Native peoples. And on top of this, just last week, and this is always in the news, one of our senators called for reports to reflect more of the good parts of residential school students' experiences. There are no good parts to genocidal practices. The final report of the TRC, published in 2015, made 94 concrete recommendations to facilitate reconciliation from this history, addressing the legacy of residential schools, including a set specifically meant for museums and archives. There are also ones for universities, the legal system, and so on. Given the challenging past relationship between the TRC and archival institutions, they had to take some archives to court in order to get documentation released. These recommendations are perhaps not surprising. As a result of the TRC Commission and recommendations, the last few years have seen a plethora of exhibitions, residencies, and other art activities aimed at addressing Canada's residential school history and present-day consequences in the public. The Commission has even urged the federal government to work with Indigenous peoples to establish funded commemoration projects for the 150th anniversary of Canada relating to this reconciliation. Yet we are being asked to celebrate 150 years of history instead of 12,000 years of human occupation on Turtle Island, 150 years of occupation on stolen land. How do we celebrate the resilience of Indigenous peoples during this anniversary? And how do we exhibit Indigenous histories of displacement and dispossession in the same period without reducing thousands of years of Indigenous history to a few hundred years of colonization and post-colonial efforts? How do we grapple with this idea of reconciliation? Echoing Monica's line of questioning from earlier this morning, who is the who is meant, that's a little Dr. Susie, who's the who who's meant to do the heavy lifting in the reconciliation of difficult knowledge and histories? Who is the work for? Who needs forgiveness? And who is meant to do the forgiving? And what is the timeline in which this work is meant to take place? As Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang note, secular colonialism is a structure, not an event. I have both great optimism, or as Angela noted, hope, about the potential of museums and curatorial practice, and I believe in the power of artworks and exhibitions to reconfigure the way that we approach knowledge and history. But I also have serious questions about creating exhibitions that become theaters of Indigenous pain, that have expectations to swiftly deliver closure around anniversaries, to hasten moving on and getting over it, which is something we hear all the time, and suspicions about the development of a cottage industry around reconciliation art and artists. Furthermore, the undue pressures that come along with this work that expects curators, museums, and artists to do this difficult work for us, as spectators and consumers, instead of really engaged in the work of reconciliation. So those are the things that I think about through this project.
Thank you. So next we have Professor Monica Patterson, who is an anthropologist, historian, and curator, co-editor of the volume Curating Difficult Knowledge, Violent Pasts in Public Places, and is also director of the newly launched program in curatorial studies at Carleton University in Ottawa.
So by now, everyone is well aware of the ways in which scholars and practitioners have increasingly questioned and challenged many of the traditions upon which museum practice has been based. The exclusion of underrepresented and historically oppressed groups in museum collections, exhibits, and staff rooms has also come under increasing scrutiny, as have curatorial authority, classificatory and exhibitionary practices, and the relationship between museums and the publics they serve. As we have seen these past few days, a wide range of historically marginalized communities have taken museums and galleries to task for perpetuating their erasure and misrepresentation. Forward-looking museums have adopted community consultation and outreach models and created more participatory displays. But one significant group remains largely outside of these movements and debates, and that group is children. Despite experimentation with temporary exhibitions, many mainstream museums maintain their elite conservative auras, preserving while effacing their curatorial authority. And in my view, children are one of the last minority groups to gain recognition. So running parallel to the shift toward democratization and inclusivity is the burgeoning field of children's rights, increasingly recognized and mobilized through a panoply of legislation, organizational support, and educational outreach. And I will say that while my own position on the universalist framing of children's rights, especially as codified in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child ratified in 1990, is a largely critical one, there is no denying that it has shaped our understandings of children and childhood and affected policy and practice pertaining to children to a significant degree. Most significantly, children's rights talk and work has promoted the recognition of an engagement with children's agency in very important and productive ways. So when it comes to museums and galleries, where do children fit into the picture? Why do their voices, their experiences, and their status as visitors so often remain bracketed as side notes, or worse yet, treated in one of two main registers, as either just cute or especially heart-wrenching illustrations of more substantive content and analysis? And historically, the answer to where they fit in the picture has been children's museums, but also increasingly we're seeing museums and galleries developing special content spaces and programming, targeting children and reflecting their voices and experiences. And we have a really interesting example to think through here in the POLIN Museum. But I would argue that this content, and particularly the potential engagement around it, deserve more investment by museums and more rigorous analysis by museum studies scholars. So the reason I think this hasn't happened to the degree that I'd like must lie in the historical subalternity of children in general. So this has resulted in highly specialized, limited areas of academic inquiry that typically remain isolated and on the margins of the major disciplinary canons. So because children are physically, intellectually, experientially, and cognitively different from adults, they and the lessons they can teach us are typically overlooked as being relevant only to the young. These differences, which vary significantly by age and by child, are extremely difficult to accommodate in a single site and pose challenging ethical questions about how and when children should confront knowledge of mass violence and graphic material, just as two examples. So for me, the two main issues are the absence or marginalization of children and their cultural production, and particular concerns being featured in general content for adult consumption. And secondly, the limited content accessible to children that is not patronizing, exclusive, silencing, or any number of other things. So the difficult knowledge that most captivates me is knowledge that's by, for, and about children. And of course, each of these registers looks different and presents different challenges. So to wrap things up, as South African author and activist Kabiba Badaroon has written, what we choose to display in our public places, who curates our perspectives, who becomes visible to us in art, represents a national conversation of who we are. At global, national, and local levels, museums can thus extend the parameters of various communities' visibility and engagement. And in my recently published chapter in Shelley, Butler, and Erika Lehrer's volume, Curatorial Dreams, I explore the possibilities for including children's experiences and perspectives in museum exhibits and programming, not just as subjects or as target audience members, but as active participants and co-creators of museum content. And that's really the area of growth that I think needs to happen. So focusing on the Children's Hospital Museum in Durban, South Africa, I consider its transformative potential to address the interconnections between contemporary health issues and apartheid history, particularly as they relate to the underacknowledged and oversimplified history of children's rights in South Africa. This is a history of violence, racism, and sickness, but also one of resilience and agency. It is a history where lovely and difficult knowledge are intimately intertwined. So employing curatorial strategies designed to enhance participation and engagement, my proposed exhibit explores the challenges involved in including children's voices and experiences and their input as actively engaged co-producers of knowledge in remembrances of the past as a means of understanding and addressing contemporary socioeconomic inequality.
Thanks. So Okay, now on to the polls. So now we have Hanna Radziejowska, who is an historian and curator who's worked at multiple Warsaw institutions, including the Warsaw Uprising Museum, the Dom Spotkań's Historią, or the sort of House of Encounters with History, and the Museum of the City of Warsaw, whose Wola branch she directed from April 2013 to November 2015, where she created really boundary-pushing exhibitions such as, and I apologize for the translation, Masus's, or Warsaw from an Intimate Perspective, and Reinefahrt in Warsaw, Evidence of the Crime.
Thank you. So I'm cultural manager. In fact, I'm also the curator of some exhibitions. But this description that I'm historian, it's well, I have finished the history. But what's my short overview? It's the perspective of the museum's activist, and well, I'm a practitioner, so I will try to, everything what I will say is relevant to this exhibition Reinefahrt in Warsaw, Evidence of Crime, and the educational and political projects that were the consequences of this exhibition. I jak można poprosić zmienić tę planszę? O, dziękuję. So this is this exhibition, and well, I would like to say something about this difficult knowledge in public and how from my point of view. So I think it's in fact it's something that concerns historical events, and it's much more than experience of encounters around historical and cultural material. I mean, that's this topic that can till today divide us, divide society, political community. All these things that can produce great emotions and tensions are in this content history. Yes, and well, it is something that doesn't allow us to assimilate this horrible, tragic, difficult history in our political community, in our society, and so on. So difficult knowledge, one of this example of story of Reinefahrt, I will say something about it later. It's, in my opinion, it's results directly from the concrete content history. So, well, it's. I was a curator of this exhibition, and it was opened as the part of the 70th anniversary of Warsaw Rising in 2014. And what is important, it was the first exhibition about the Wola massacre. And what was it? It's the Wola massacre lasted from the 5th August in 1944. And according to various estimates, between 30 to 60,000 district residents were murdered. So it was in 2-3 days it all happened. And SS General Heinz Reinefahrt, called in this context the Warsaw executioner, became the deputy to the Schleswig-Holstein Landtag and the mayor of the town of Westerland on the holiday island Sylt after the war. And the essence of this exhibition was to look at this event as a crime for which no one has been convicted. This exhibition at the Wola Museum was based on the unknown documents in Poland, which were used during investigation in Heinz Reinefahrt's proceedings. There were 3, but this is the most important, was in 1963 till 1967. And these proceedings, participation in mass killings. And it was conducted by the German prosecutor's office in Flensburg, and on a especially large scale. It questioned more than 1,000 German witnesses and interrogated more than 250 witnesses from Poland. And however, the decision of the German court was to close the proceeding for lack of sufficient evidence. And now let's back to this problem of difficult knowledge. So I worked, I know Wola district very good, and I was the first thing was that there was no exhibition concerning to this topic, yes, to this Wola massacre. There was no book about it. Today it's very hard to imagine this, but this time I was sure that I and my team, we were preparing the first exhibition about this. And this tragic event, this massacre, it's not only the key to understand generally the history of Wola and how does it look like today, but it's also the key to understand the space of Wola district, because it is, if someone will visit it, you can see something like, it's a mix of the old and new buildings, a city, we can see there is city chaos, but there is also great void, the emptiness, and you can really feel something like not places. I don't know how to say it. It's something that's you can see the places where this massacre was happened, but sometimes naturally there are some informations in Polish, but it's not. This space is till now it's not designed. It's very difficult space. And our intuition, it's something that it's like, it's okay. The Wola massacre is a good example of Warsaw trauma. That, of course, no one knows exactly till today how many people were murdered. We don't have not many things that remained. For example, on this exhibition, you can see we didn't have objects. It was just text. And it's, of course, it's hard to imagine where all these horrible things, this massacre happened, but it's hard to live in such a place too. Of course, when you will imagine what happened, yes. So our intuition was that it's something like social refusal, avoidance. This is what is a difficult knowledge about this Wola massacre, and that's why this exhibition, the aim, what we wanted to do, the task was to, okay, when there is a lack of justice, we can say that there is a double victimization, something that happened to Wola residents. And this exhibition, as I told you, it was based on the legal materials. So we presented the knowledge according to Polish and German legal documents, and what was important, in the end of this exhibition, there was space for lawyers' comments. So today, how they see this, what happened, and how we can describe this crime. And the visitors could compare these 2 points of view. So on the left there was a Polish point of view, on the right there was a German. And in the end you can see that Reinefeld, this SS general, he was never convicted and sentenced. So we wanted to take this take this story and show it in this. Okay, sorry, so I'm finishing. But okay, so I would just the political educational project. So. We wanted to provide the justice, not only with this exhibition, but also we engage our museum in this action. We invited Petra Reiber, the authorities and other authorities of Sylt Island, and organized not only this visit, but also the meetings with the people who survived the Wola massacre. And because of this exhibition, because of this action, it was first time when the German authorities, they said officially sorry for Wola massacre, and they asked for forgiveness. And as also consequences of this meeting, of this visit, and of this exhibition, we organized the workshops and collaboration between Wola schools, Wola students, and Sylt students. And in the end, there was a project, the Cultural Arts Project, where students are Fine Academy Art school. They, from Germany, from Berlin, and from Warsaw, they worked together, and they did yes, a special exhibition. It was not only inspired by Wola massacre, but generally it was based on this visiting and exploring of Wola district. But the idea was the consequence of this whole exhibition and working with this difficult knowledge. And what I would like in the end to say in the end that my opinion is that the task of the museum, the public institution, is to create the space where this difficult knowledge can be assimilated, and where we can look in this. The task of the curator is to look into this history, what in this content you can find, why it is today difficult, what is present in our space, what we can see from this difficult history today, and to create the exhibition, the projects to solve this problem, to give the chance for to give the chance for this assimilation, and also to how to say it, to reconciliation, in fact. Okay, so thank you. Sorry for this long.
Thank you. So next we have Magdalena Zych, who is a cultural anthropologist and a curator at the Severin Ujela Ethnographic Museum in Krakow, where she has conducted participatory research resulting in exhibits such as The Art of the Allotment, which I have to say had a wonderfully conflicted sort of public reception, and Weddings 21, about wedding practices in the present day. And she's currently working on the project Awkward Objects of Genocide, Vernacular Arts of Holocaust Witness.
Thank you, Erika. Thank you for your invitation for this discussion. I want to show you some place. Yes, we are. It's not easy to deal with the challenge of rethinking peasant heritage. I will talking about this in the Ethnographic Museum. The story about peasant culture in Poland is part of the national symbolic structure and plays an important role as a political tool. What you see here is the Ethnographic Museum in Krakow. Our main exhibit at Krakow Ethnographic Museum is a colorful romantic story about rural and peasant traditions without clear connection with contemporary context. Missing is the violence, the different ethnic identities, and the history of the peasant struggle against oppression by the nobility nor land reform. As Eva Kleko told us, the first day of this conference, ethnographic museums in Poland silence conflicts and aestheticize diversity. But I have some case to tell you about this exhibition. In summer 1951, the Ethnographical Museum in Krakow was reopened. The museum had been founded in 1911 during the period when Poland didn't exist as an independent country. In the 50s, after years of war, after organization the museum in a new place, in the former Jewish city hall built in a Renaissance period, what you see here, museum reopened its doors. The director, Tadeusz Seweryn, called for an exhibit about peasant culture. 80% of collection is about rural countryside traditions. That time the working class was the focus of communistic ideology. That class included inhabitants of rural areas, peasants. The new galleries of museum were about them, their culture, history and new political situation, and about New Poland. The exhibition started from photos of villages destroyed by war. Next were 3 interiors of peasant cottages and few craft workshops. Then was the story about the centuries of the struggle of the peasants with the Polish feudal overlords. What is important, it's a contemporary photo, it's a small piece of this old exhibition. What is important is that Tadeusz Seweryn was a well-educated artist, art historian, ethnographer and soldier. He was born in a peasant family. He was the director of the museum from 1938, and after war he came back to his workplace. During the war he was responsible for civil defense in Krakow. and was a head of underground court, so informers collaborated with Gestapo were tried under his supervision. In 1982, Yad Vashem recognized him as a lighthouse among the nations. Today we have some version of this old exhibit, but without important details of historical context, which were important for Tadeusz Seweryn. From first version, we have two cottage interiors, without this important war and class conflict explanation. The main exhibition was changed in the 60s of 20th century and 90s. Now it's talking about national peasant identity without dark, important historical context, revolt and conflicts. In 90s, after fall of communism, the exhibition started to be perceived in clear way as propaganda by museum team and the public. The interpretation work of museum's team is visible in new presentations, in temporary exhibitions, in many different educational work. But unfortunately, the main exhibition is not easy to change. It is budget question, but also political issue. People like the peasant tradition is framed in predictable way. But I see possibilities to develop new strategies to deal with all those questions about conflicted peasant tradition, for example, by cooperation and co-production with people who heard the false notes. And maybe a few examples. In 2012, Erika mentioned already, we prepared as a museum the project about allotment culture, urban gardening, with Łucja Piekarska-Duraj, who this afternoon talked about heroes. And that project involved a lot of people in cooperation, was invitation to cooperation with people in Krakow. Another example is project, Erika project, which was presented in the museum in 2003. That was interesting. I hope that Erika will talk us more. Another example is work with Erika and Roma Sendyka, who was presented issue about Płaszów in Krakow for this conference. So their students are now practicing curatorial dreaming method of Shelley, Ruth, Butler on our exhibition. Thanks to them, I found in archives old scenario and realized this old scenario, this exhibition of Tadeusz Seweryn. And I realized that it will be really useful to think through the museum's history to create a new exhibition, which is planned in time by director of the museum, Antoni Bartosz, probably for 3 years. And for the end, I should say that these 3 beautiful days which I spending with you was so inspiring. And I should say thank you for Heather about this indigenous definition which she proposed. I thought who is indigenous in Poland. And another conception by Canadian, another conception by Peter Kulczynski. I thought about Bush Museum. So thank you.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, we have Aleksandra Janus, who is a researcher, activist, and PhD candidate at the Jagiellonian University. She's working on visitor studies in Polish historical museums. She's involved in numerous initiatives promoting openness and participatory practice in the GLAM sector. And for those who aren't in the know, that's galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. She's a member of Roma Sendyka's research project, Unmemorialized Sites of Genocide. And with Hanna Radziejowska, or Hanna here, she developed Warsaw's really quite important museum laboratory, which brings new critical forms of museum practice to Polish curators.
Thank you, Erika. What I'm going to discuss here briefly is related to 3 dimensions of my work as a researcher, as a cultural worker, let's say, an activist. And I will begin with research. 3 years ago, I did a visitor study in 4 selected Polish historical museums. And I was interested in the new exhibitions dealing with the history and difficult history of the Second World War that were opened after 2004. And these were mainly exhibitions using strategies based on spectacle and simulation, as such approach is dominating among new Polish historical museums. Providing immersive space and coherent narratives, such exhibitions proved to be very successful in creating emotional and personal engagement. On one hand, that can serve reinforcing social cohesion through responding to identity-related needs of visitors or promote certain moral examples. On the other hand, they are successful in creating myths and heroic myths that we've discussed today already, that are easy to pick up by pop culture and carry not only a risk of imposing fixed narratives that facilitate nostalgia instead of showing the complexity of difficult past, but as well a risk mentioned by Kevin Walsh, which is important to me, the risk that results in creating hyper-realistic pasts, one that can be easily visited and revisited as a kind of parallel universe. And what is more, as my research has shown, the dominance of such exhibition strategies has shaped the visitor expectations regarding the historical museums in general. And I could observe that in relation to one example of more critical approach I included in my research, and it was an exhibition described by Hanna, and the exhibition about Wola massacre, so the act of killing of thousands of civilians. And what was important for me especially was that instead of positioning the visitor back then as exhibitions based on spectacle often do, this exhibition, highly inspired by courtroom-like situations, invited visitors to investigate documents of the past and develop his or her own interpretation and judgment, but like situated today. And the experience of this research project was the context for the museum laboratory that Eric already mentioned, a program for museum professionals and curators I created together with Hanna, Radziejowska and Anna Banaś. And the program was rooted in the tradition of new museology, which is already an old lady, and critical museology, and promoted more inclusive participatory approach in museum practice. What we have learned after this first edition of the museum laboratory was that to promote new, more critical models and approaches, we need a space for experiments, which is usually absent or lacking in the regime of everyday work in the museum, and equally important within the logic of public funding and granting programs, where we are obligated to do what we've declared and have particular, often precise results. So if the program will continue, as I hope it will, I see it more and more as a space for sort of museum prototyping, so that museum professionals can work with new methods and approaches and do small-scale projects in safe environment where they can fail and make mistakes and learn from it, and to check to what extent museum can be a tool for social change. And the last part is collections, so I would like to refer to collections themselves, because we were talking about collections and the way they can reveal their own history or historicity and their own background and origins. And the process of the accessioning, especially in the case of ethnographic museums, was mentioned here. And I often ask myself, what is the potential of the digital in this context? And I think openness, understood as open access as a policy, in sharing collections online might be seen as an attempt to share authority, as it opens up a space for bottom-up initiatives and crowdsourcing or co-curation. However, it requires confronting many challenges, legal issues to be solved, and sustainability of such initiatives and their long-term maintenance, as well as the need for new curatorial practices related to digital content, aware both of the potential and challenges related to usership. And with more and more digital collections digitized and shared online, I see these questions as urgent. And I think we would like us to think of how is it possible, and I often find myself encouraging museums and institutions to open up and share their collection, and I feel we often fail to show that the content that we provide is really used by what we would like to, but by who we would like to reach out with this content. Thank you.
Thank you. So I guess we have about 15 minutes. I just wanted to reflect that, none of the scholars really talked about the experiments that they're actually doing. So as it sort of proves my point that we're so much better at critique. But they are all doing interesting experiments if anybody wants to ask them about that. But anyway, so many interesting issues put on the table. So now is the chance for you all to discuss. And I guess this is the sort of summation of the conference. So what do you think museums should be doing? Where should they be going? What issues seem pressing? Comments, questions?
Thank you. This is really a question for the Canadian contingent. As I'm sure you're aware, Canada's National Arts Centre is about to open an Indigenous theatre department, which is just a very major thing to happen in the world. I'm just wondering how you think, how relevant it is, well, I mean, to the universe really, but also to just the discussion and the work that we're talking about here. Thank you.
I think it is hugely important. I mean, I think if we look at the history of Indigenous art in Canada, we have up to very recently been so dominated by the modern, which really focuses on those objects created by Indigenous peoples that also fit in with Western modern art formats. And so to have a Indigenous National Theatre where we're talking about intangible cultural heritage, about performance and storytelling and orality and music and dance and all the things that are, very vital aspects of Indigenous cultures that were banned from practice in many cases across Canada throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. I think it's, as you've said, it's really huge that the National Arts Centre is going to give over such a platform, and also, as you know, is actively seeking to hire an Indigenous director for this as well. So building that leadership in at the very highest level, and then having, Indigenous people, I hope, in both on the stage and in the back of the house. Does anybody else have a comment on that? All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's really amazing, very interesting. One of the things that I've noticed about the Human Rights Museum, and this comes from conversations that some of us at the University of the Western Cape have been having with Canadian colleagues from the University of Toronto, around truth and reconciliation, museum making, and puppetry. I might be wrong, and this connects to conversations that we had earlier today about architecture and museums and the problems of certain kinds of monumentalisms. And another problem with museum making that we haven't really discussed is how easy it is to spend budgets by bringing in the consultants and the professional company. Will just come and make your museum. So the museum is just like a themed environment. The impression that I have is that museum was made by lords. I might...
Meaning the Lord Cultural Resources.
Lord Museum Inc. International corporation, and that because we've had experience of Lord in South Africa, at Constitution Hill, where basically this method of museum making results in an incredibly disempowered space, because the museum has it's got an exhibition, but it actually has no soul. And I've never been to Winnipeg, I've never seen the museum, but I'm very interested whether the problems that you've been addressing are partly connected to that being part of the history of this museum. I've got other questions as well, but let's leave it there.
I'll say maybe one thing about the consulting issue, and then I'll give it to Angela to speak about the CMHR, but I think that's really very crucial what you pointed out about this layer of sort of museum consulting, and particularly there is this one, very kind of monolithic company that has, been working with many museums around the globe, and I had the very interesting experience of of serving on one of their, they have a kind of formatted, consulting situations, and it's really interesting on this issue of how can sort of scholars and other actors relate, have relationships with museums, and of what kinds, because they did actually a quite fascinating and open-ended kind of consulting with a number of scholars. It was a 2-day thing, and they sort of wined and dined us, and wide-ranging, wonderful, a great group of people. But then by the second day, they had actually reduced this fascinating conversation to like 10 points, and at that point we were just allowed to sort of choose, like vote on these things. And by looking at the list, I thought, like, well, that's what you got out of that conversation. And so I do think that layer, which often is not spoken about, it's as if there's like the museum and then people outside, but there is this other kind of international layer.
I think this is a really important point. Like, I think there is something about the scale and the monumentality of this museum that is really intimidating for so many museum goers, and I think it just it does make the opportunity for engagement, I think, less, because you're really the prospect of actually scaling the ramps to make it through this museum is exhausting, and people have made critiques of its accessibility and so forth. But what's something interesting about the museum that I learned is before it was finally mapped out, there was a vision for an area of the museum that was a temporary gallery that could potentially be curated by communities. The museum itself has very little art. It has very few objects as well. So it's mainly these humongous kind of digital didactic panels and interactive kinds of games, I'm gonna say. Somehow through the process, this space just disappeared. This space that was going to be more of a collaborative, community curated space, and I've always been sort of curious about that. There is a big temporary exhibit space that traveling sort of global big box exhibits do sort of move through. But I think, again, there was maybe a missed opportunity there, and so I think where the most exciting and critical things can happen now are in the programming potentially, or actually outside of this museum, but as responses to this museum. Just briefly, one of the most interesting responses to the Canadian Museum for Human Rights was a community-based project called the Museum of Canadian Human Rights Violations that Shoal Lake 40 First Nations community, a First Nations community 2 hours away from Winnipeg, basically opened its own community as a living museum, and they launched their living museum at the same time that the CMHR opened. And this community had actually been petitioning the Canadian Museum for Human Rights and lobbying it for more than a decade to have their community's story told. And the main story about this community is that this community, Shoal Lake, provides 95% of the water that Winnipeg, the city, uses. 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, the city went and built a 200-kilometer aqueduct to move water out of the First Nation and out of Shoal Lake to the city, where it's now processed, and we drink and use it every day. In the meanwhile, this community has no potable water, no drinkable water. For 20 years, it has been under a boil water advisory. And the aqueduct also cut that First Nations community, severed it from the mainland, so it became an artificial island. So it is inaccessible in so many ways, and it has just created conditions of extreme poverty in that community. So when it launched its own Museum of Canadian Human Rights Violations, you know, it was a brilliant curatorial strategy, and it began to get, you know, federal attention finally in its piggybacking off of the CMHR, and, you know, famous people like scientists like David Suzuki, famous Canadian scientist, started to pay attention to it, and it eventually generated some political will and action to help build an access road into this community. So for me, these are sort of the most interesting and generative things that have come of this, you know, of the big museum, of the National Museum, these responses that have happened, you know, outside of its walls.
I wonder if in the last couple minutes there are maybe some questions for our Polish colleagues. Jackie?
I want to ask, thank you to all of you for these wonderful presentations. Aleksandra, Janus, okay. If you could provide some example of your work with digital sharing of materials, and to what extent, how much control is necessary, particularly when one deals with knowledge of conflicted situations or of conflicts that are not resolved? Is there an area where the museum wants to maintain control over offensive reactions? I'd love to hear from your experience.
Thank you for that question, and this is really important question, because usually when I work with museums that are willing to share collections online related to sensitive topics, let's say, or difficult heritage, they really struggle to find ways to control the content and the way it might be used. And there is the huge discussion in the whole, let's say, like among other open activists and museum professionals, whether we should or should not control such sensitive content. And I believe like the problem is somehow elsewhere. I think like there are plenty of collections shared online that are not used at all, and people do not know about them and don't use them either for research purposes or other. And there are several examples of like misuse of the collection. And usually it's hard to protect yourself as an institution from such a misusage, because usually the content somehow is already online or could be found online. So I think like it's a better way is to share it as openly as you can legally, and then find a way for curating it in a way that it's contextualized and people can find it and learn from it, and do not protect it from like being used. And then if it's misused, I think there are other paragraphs to deal with that. So that would be my answer. I hope it answers your questions.
I think we maybe have time for one more question. Katarzyna?
Thank you all. It was an amazing experience. I have a question to Professor Butler. Thank you for sharing those moments of difficult knowledge with us. It was especially precious for me. I wonder, what are your ideas for teaching this knowledge, for sharing it, so that then it translates into agency rather than paralysis, both affective and intellectual? How to not only live with difficult knowledge on this individual level, but how to transfer it?
That's a really great question. And I'm not sure that I've given it proper thought, but my intuition, I think, which I kind of tried to express, has been, for one thing, to allow myself to be vulnerable and show my own process. And I think that helps students to do the same. I think it's also little things like, I think, a decade ago, in a standard Canadian studies class, you started with Indigenous, and then once that was done, you carried on, and you never mentioned indigeneity again. And it's like, no, we're not going to do it that way. And you know, indigeneity is going to be integrated everywhere, and we're going to engage and live with it, and think about these various things. So I think that's like definitely one way of teaching. So I guess I'm coming back to my point about, I really think it is iterative. I don't think there is one moment, because at least when I think to my own process, I can't say, oh, that was the moment, you know. So I think that it is kind of trying to convey that to people, and you know, just because you do one course in Indigenous authors, well, hopefully, you know, 5 years down the road, you're going to read, or 10 years down the road, you're going to read the next generation and of Indigenous authors, and it will, you know, everything will evolve. So I guess it's trying to dispel a notion of mastery and being able to live with a bit of discomfort.
Well, thank you very much. So that concludes the panel, and I guess there are some concluding remarks that Gosha will be making. Yes?
First of all, thank you for the panel. I think you really we owe you some applause for that. And so my role now is just to close the conference, and I think it was all extremely interesting. I knew it would be, but I actually didn't expect it would be so interesting. I only wish I could be at 3 places at the same time to attend all the papers, and I could see that some of you have chosen the same strategy of changing rooms between the panels, so to be able to witness to at least part of the discussions taking place in the different rooms. So my role now is to give you some practical information. First of all, that you have the memory sticks that you may have probably not noticed in the conference materials. And on the memory sticks, you have the biograms of each of us, so I think it may be useful to have the list of the conference participants and to stay in touch, for which we hope. We will be in touch with you. We will include you to our list of contacts, and we will be informing you, if you don't mind, about the events that the POLIN Museum is organizing, and I hope that you can share important information with us too. We will be happy to distribute this information. An important news that the whole conference was video recorded. We have video recorded all things that were taking place in the 3 rooms parallelly. So, and we will edit it and put it online, so you can try to go on our website and to see and to listen to the papers that you were not able to listen to here. And one thing I have to tell you too, that there are evaluation forms on the conference desks before in the foyer, before the entrance here. We would be very grateful if you could fill them in and tell what you did like, what you didn't like about the conference. I hope that you did like it. And last but not least, I really have to thank everybody, and I would like to do it on behalf of the conference organizers, who are Bruce Altschuler and the New York University, Annie Coombs and Gabriel Kauries, on behalf of the Birkbeck University of London, Iwona Kusz from the University of Warsaw, the Institute of Polish Culture, and Dorota Folga-Januszewska from ICOM Poland, and I will just double check that I haven't omitted anyone, and Erika Lehrer on behalf of Concordia University, and Barbara Kirschenberg-Gimblet, POLIN Museum. We are really, really very grateful and honored that we were able to organize this event in such a really, with such prestigious company of academic and museum institutions. So on behalf of this committee and institutions, I would like to thank you all for being here and for the extremely interesting discussions. And I thank you also to the wonderful colleagues from the research department at the POLIN Museum. They have worked really, really hard to organize this event. I see them here sitting, smiling. Please stand up. And
Gosha, can I ask for a round of applause for you, too? This is what kept us all together, actually. So, thank you.
Thank you. That's really not the necessary part of that. I hope you will be in touch with them again, because they are really the wonderful people to be in touch. So, and there is also the whole team of other departments in the museum, the communications, the administrative and the technician staff. You could see how the PowerPoint presentations were changing so smoothly and so smartly. Big thanks to the whole museum staff. And to the translators, too. And this is it. Thank you.